It doesn't always look like loneliness. Sometimes it just looks like someone who enjoys being alone, someone who keeps their circle small, someone who doesn't talk much about their personal life. And after a while, people start assuming that's simply your personality. But when someone has been lonely for a long time, not just physically alone, but emotionally disconnected, something deeper starts to happen inside the mind. The way they think changes. The way they read people changes. Even the way they protect themselves begins to shift. And most of the time, they don't even realize it. Because when loneliness lasts long enough, it stops feeling temporary. It quietly becomes part of your identity. One of the first hidden traits that often develops is a very strong inner world. People who spend long periods feeling emotionally alone start living more inside their own thoughts, not because they want to escape reality, but because their mind becomes the safest place available. When you can't rely on people to consistently understand you, your brain adapts. It learns to process things internally. Conversations that never happened play out in your head. You rehearse explanations you might never say out loud. You analyze interactions long after they're over. From the outside, this can look like overthinking, but psychologically, it's something deeper. It's self-containment. Your mind becomes both the place where problems appear and the place where they're solved. And over time, this creates a person who is extremely reflective, but also someone who rarely feels fully understood by others. Another quiet trait that develops is emotional self-reliance. When someone goes a long time without consistent emotional support, the brain slowly stops expecting it. Not consciously, just quietly. You stop reaching out as much. You stop explaining your feelings in detail. And when something difficult happens, your first instinct isn't to call someone. It's to sit with it alone. At first, this feels like independence, and in some ways it is. But psychologically, it's also a protective adaptation. Because expecting comfort and not receiving it enough times teaches the brain something important. It's safer not to rely on anyone too deeply. So the person becomes very capable of handling things alone. But the trade-off is subtle. They may start believing that needing people is a weakness, even though the real reason is simply that their mind learned not to expect support. And here's where it gets interesting. Many people assume long-term loneliness creates someone who desperately seeks attention or connection. But in reality, the opposite often happens. Instead of chasing connection, the mind becomes extremely cautious about it. This leads to the third hidden trait, emotional filtering. People who have been lonely for a long time often become very selective about who they open up to. Not because they think they're better than others, but because their brain has become highly sensitive to emotional risk. They notice small signals others might miss, a slight shift in tone, a delayed response, a moment where someone seems disinterested. These signals get processed quickly, sometimes even subconsciously, and the mind quietly asks one question: is this safe? Because when someone has spent enough time feeling unseen or misunderstood, their brain starts protecting them from repeating that experience. So instead of opening up easily, they observe first. They test emotional safety slowly. And to outsiders, it can look like distance, but psychologically, it's caution built from experience. The fourth trait is something many people never connect to loneliness at all: a quiet sense of emotional self-containment. People who have been lonely for a long time often become very calm on the surface. They don't react dramatically. They don't share every thought or emotion immediately.
And when something painful happens, they process it privately. This can make them seem incredibly strong, and in many ways they are. But the reason behind this calm isn't always natural emotional stability. Sometimes it's familiarity. When your mind has spent years learning to handle emotions alone, expressing them outwardly starts to feel unusual, almost unnecessary. So the person becomes someone who carries a lot internally. They understand themselves deeply, but very few people fully see that depth. Over time, these traits begin shaping identity. A strong inner world, emotional self-reliance, careful emotional filtering, and a quiet, self-contained way of life. None of these traits appear suddenly. They develop slowly, almost invisibly. And most people who carry them don't think of themselves as lonely anymore. They simply believe this is who they are. But once you start noticing these patterns, something becomes very clear. Loneliness isn't always loud. It doesn't always show up as sadness or isolation. Sometimes it quietly rewires the way a person thinks, trusts, and protects themselves. And once you see that pattern, it's hard to unsee it. Because what looks like personality on the surface was often adaptation underneath. And understanding that changes the way you see yourself and the way you see others. If this explains something you've noticed in yourself or someone around you, there's always more to uncover. Because sometimes the behaviors we assume are random were never random at all.